Over the last decade, South African sports sponsorships grew by 14%, a figure well above inflation. Last year alone, over 6.4 billion rand was ploughed into sponsorship, up 5.4% even as the recession hit. But this year, as companies try to cut back on costs in a post-recession environment, there has been a flurry of corporates pulling out of sports. The most dramatic of these was Standard Bank, which after more than 10 years has dropped its cricket and soccer sponsorships. And while this spells an uncertain future for the sports concerned, the bank stands by its decision.
This was a difficult decision as we have made significant investments in both soccer and cricket. But essentially, we believe that this is a responsible, necessary and prudent decision to ensure that we support our business needs in the best possible way.
Despite the FIFA 2010 World Cup, local soccer's taken a huge knock, with both Kaizer Chiefs and Orlando Pirates, the country's biggest football clubs, each losing 15 million rand a year. But it's cricket that's been the hardest hit, losing some 100 million a year. And Standard Bank is not the only major corporate pulling out of its sports sponsorships. Absa, the country's biggest sports sponsor, has over the past few years slowly reduced its sponsorships of various stadia. The same goes for the country's biggest mobile phone company, Vodacom, which after 15 years as a rugby sponsor is reassessing its position in the sport.
We're seeing kind of decreasing margins, decreasing sales. So sales are flattening, margins are coming down. So there's lots of cost pressure on us. We also have a greater responsibility to deliver value for the customer. And so we've made a decision to look for ways of decreasing costs. With some of our contracts with SA Rugby and some of the teams coming to an end, we've had to optimize our sponsorship portfolio and say which do we think we see as bigger opportunities going into the future, and which can we not afford currently, and that's how we've come to the decision.
But some industry experts say that the pullout of corporates from sports sponsorship is nothing unusual or anything to be alarmed about.
Is cricket synonymous with Standard Bank? I think in some ways it is. They'll be able to ride on that for some time as well, but I'm sure someone else will be coming in to take that up. Big thing though that has been happening in South Africa the last 5 years or so is people have been saying that they felt that sports sponsorship was getting too much of the marketing budget. And that's been talked about for some time. And I know that as a result, marketing has been spending more and more money to acquire those properties. Prices have got up very, very high. And again, with recessionary times, perhaps you have a correction. Perhaps guys are saying, we're not going to play games anymore. We've been paying a lot of money, we're not getting the return. We're going to step aside, let the market settle back down again, and then we can go back in perhaps later on.
And it's not all doom and gloom. Absa, which has some 300 million rand invested in sports, is staying in the game and remains heavily involved in rugby. Currently, the bank is in talks with the Springbok rugby team to take over Sasol's 65 million rand sponsorship.
Let's take football, for example. Some of the product offerings that we have, for instance, entry-level banking. You find that we get a lot of our followers of football who are into that area. But at the same time, there are people at the top end of the market, private banking, who are also big supporters of football. You find the same happens with rugby, that it straddles both worlds. So it is a question of choosing a demographic, at the same time choosing a sport that reflects that demographic. So rugby and football have actually helped us straddle those worlds at the top and at the bottom. So it's a perfect match. And at the same time, when we leverage, for instance, we did deposits and savings as far as the Absa Carry Cup is concerned, and we run competitions, and we see a spike. Every time we leverage the sponsorship and the games are running, you see a spike going up in terms of savings and investments. And you say to yourself, there must be a correlation between what we've been doing with this particular property and what has happened during that time. Because when we stop, you see a drop.
And despite the bank's pullout from Cricket South Africa, the sports body says it's not going out for a duck, or at least not yet anyway.
We've put a sponsorship search strategy in place, which cuts across various levels, some of which I can't tell you about, but we've been very pleased by the huge amount of interest in sponsoring cricket properties, both from our existing sponsors a number of sponsors have shown an interest in picking up some of the Standard Bank properties, but also outside of cricket, so outside of traditional cricket sponsors, there's been a huge amount of interest from a number of very interesting sources. So losing Standard Bank has been very sad news and a blow, but we're actually feeling quite optimistic about some of the potential new sponsors that could be entering cricket.
So the picture might not be as dire as initially thought, but it would seem that the industry is still waiting on the third umpire's decision as to who will take over Standard Bank's cricket sponsorship. This largely depends on the health of South Africans' corporate balance sheets and the pace of economic recovery.